The Village That Changed Its Past, a Miss Marple Mystery. Section 1. The Village at its Gentlest Hour. St Mary Mead had never been so quietly pleased with itself as on that particular Wednesday morning in early June. The lilacs along the vicarage wall were in their fullest, most extravagant bloom. The bees, having risen early, were already at their industrious devotions among them. Mrs Price Ridley's cat, whose ill temper was proverbial, had condescended to lie in a patch of sun by the post office door, and old Mr Dorridge, who had not been observed to smile in 14 years, was smiling faintly at nothing in particular. Even the parish clock, which had a habit of losing 3 minutes between one striking and the next, appeared, for the moment, to have decided to keep time honestly. Into this bright and unresisting calm walked Miss Jane Marple, in her second-best cardigan, carrying a small basket of gooseberries intended, if one were being strictly accurate, for the vicarage kitchen, and, if one were being truthful, for the vicar's wife, Griselda, whose affection for Gooseberry Fool had achieved local celebrity. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved with their usual mild interest over the high street, over Mrs Bantry's new gardening gloves drying on a windowsill, over the fresh coat of paint on the Blue Boar's sign, over the 2 schoolchildren whispering at the corner of Mill Lane. She noted, without appearing to note, that the whispering was more urgent than schoolchildren normally attempted at this hour, and that one of them kept glancing over her shoulder toward the churchyard. Within 3 minutes of Miss Marple's having reached the corner, the disturbance came. It came in the form of Colonel Bantry, without a hat, walking too quickly for a man of his dignity, and behind him, at a slight run, the parish clerk, Mr Enderby, whose face was the colour of paper. They passed her without seeing her, which, in the Colonel's case, was as remarkable as the disappearance of the sun. "Miss Marple," said Griselda, appearing suddenly at the vicarage gate with a trowel and a smear of earth across her chin. "Have you heard?" "No, of course you haven't. I can see you haven't. It is Miss Halliwell, at the old rectory. She's been found. Oh dear, one shouldn't say found, ought one? It sounds so like a lost umbrella. She's been discovered, at any rate, in her drawing-room, quite still, quite cold, and the doctor says it was not natural." Miss Marple set her basket down very carefully upon the low wall, as if the gooseberries might otherwise take fright. "Poor Miss Halliwell," she said, and for the smallest fraction of a second her hand rested upon the topmost gooseberry, its bloom soft as breath. Poor Miss Halliwell, and on such a fine morning too. "Everyone is saying," Griselda went on, glancing over her shoulder as though the whole village might be pressing behind her, "that it was her heart, only it wasn't, because the doctor found, I really oughtn't to repeat it, a mark, a very small mark at the base of her neck, like a pinprick, and there was a photograph on the floor beside her, torn quite in half." "A photograph," said Miss Marple, thoughtfully, "of a person, one imagines, or a place?" "That is precisely the mystery. Nobody has yet said. They say Enderby saw it and would not speak of it, and Colonel Bantry is with Inspector Slack this very moment." Miss Marple picked up her basket again and adjusted her cardigan. "I think," she said gently, "I shall take these to your kitchen after all, my dear. It does not do to leave gooseberries in the sun. And then, perhaps, a little walk. A quiet little walk. Miss Halliwell was very fond of her garden, I remember. She had the loveliest peonies. It is quite dreadful." Griselda accepted the basket with the air of a woman who has been handed rather more than gooseberries. Miss Marple's tone had been almost apologetically mild, but Griselda had known her long enough to recognise the peculiar attentiveness beneath it. The alertness of a small grey bird noticing that a great many worms are surfacing at once. It was, thought the Colonel, who had been a soldier, and knew the look of an unfinished order, the pen of a woman who had been startled at her own writing by a knock, or a footstep, or a face at the window. At the old rectory, half a mile along the lane, the disturbance was less gentle. Miss Cordelia Halliwell, 68 years of age, a subscriber to 3 charitable magazines, a woman whose respectability had been so exact and so lifelong that it had become a kind of ornament, lay upon the drawing-room carpet, with her head turned toward the window, as if she had, at the last, been trying to see the garden. Her spectacles had fallen a little way from her outstretched hand. Upon the carpet beside her lay 2 pieces of a photograph, torn cleanly across the middle. The photograph, Inspector Slack observed with an unfortunate sniff, was of no one he recognised. A young woman, perhaps 20, standing in front of a wooden gate with a light Sunday hat and a great deal of hopeful smile. On the reverse of one half, in faded ink, was written a single word: Ellen. Ellen, said Slack out loud, and looked around the room as though someone might, with luck, produce an Ellen. No one did. Colonel Bantry, standing by the mantelpiece, cleared his throat. There has never, he said, been an Ellen at the old rectory. Miss Halliwell lived alone. Her sister, Miss Louisa, died in 1954. There is no cousin, no niece. The parish register would bear me out. Then who, said Slack, with the patience of a man who has been given nothing but photographs when he asked for facts, is Ellen? He received no answer. The clock on the mantelpiece, an ormolu piece older than any living person in the room, ticked with the placid heartlessness of an object which has watched a great many disturbances and been faintly amused by them all. Colonel Bantry, whose eyes had wandered to the little writing desk in the corner, was frowning at a blotter upon which someone had begun and had not finished a letter. Its opening words, faintly visible in the reverse of the ink, read, "My dear," and there the pen, or the woman, had stopped. Outside, along the sunken lane, the disturbance was travelling faster than any policeman. It had already reached the post office, where Mrs. Price Ridley was informing her cat that the world had changed forever. It had reached the Blue Boar, where 2 farmers had put down their beer glasses in silent, respectful astonishment. And it had reached the vicarage lawn, where Griselda, having placed the gooseberries upon a shelf, was watching Miss Marple walk slowly down the path toward the churchyard. "She's gone that way," Griselda murmured to no one in particular, "because Miss Halliwell's peonies are on the other side, and Aunt Jane will want to see the peonies before she thinks about the pinprick. She always looks at the flowers first." Miss Marple, at that same moment, was pausing beside a low iron gate. The peonies beyond it were vast, blousy, self-satisfied things, drenched in the heavy scent of a garden that had known no dust for 40 years. Yet at the very edge of the bed, hidden by the long leaves, one bloom had been broken clean off at the stem. Its head lay on the earth, the pink petals only slightly wilted. Someone, thought Miss Marple, had picked that flower and then, quite suddenly, dropped it. "Dear me," she said aloud, in the smallest and most respectable voice. "Ellen, Ellen, and a broken peony. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." She stood a moment longer at the gate, her pale eyes moving without hurry from the fallen bloom to the drawing-room window, where the curtain, half drawn, twitched once with the movement of a policeman inside. The village had held its equilibrium for perhaps 20 minutes after the doctor's discovery. Now that equilibrium was tilting, gently, quietly, the way a full teacup tilts on a saucer just before the drop. Section 2. Where the gossip begins to bloom. Miss Marple did not linger at the iron gate for more than the polite duration of 2 breaths. She turned, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and walked back along the lane at the pace of a woman who has neither hurried nor been hurried in the whole of her 70-odd years. Behind her, the broken peony lay where its picker had abandoned it, its pink head turned to the sky as though asking a question. By the time she reached the corner of the high street, the gossip had bloomed as thoroughly as Griselda's lilacs. It hung in the June air, mixing indistinguishably with the scent of the flowers, and it had already begun to arrange itself into shapes. The first and most vigorous of these shapes was Mrs. Price Ridley, whose cat had been so far disturbed by its owner's agitation that it had retreated beneath a hydrangea and refused to come out. Mrs. Price Ridley stood in the middle of the post office pavement, her handbag pressed against her bosom, addressing 3 ladies simultaneously. "And I always said," she was declaring as Miss Marple drew near, "that Miss Halliwell was too particular to be safe. A woman who arranges her scissors by size on the mantelpiece is a woman who has something to conceal." "Oh, surely not, Mrs. Price Ridley," murmured little Miss Weatherby, whose eyes were already very wide indeed. She was such a quiet woman. "Quiet women," pronounced Mrs. Price Ridley, "are precisely the women one must watch. It stands to reason. If a woman is quiet, one must ask oneself, What is she not saying? Miss Marple, drawing level, coughed apologetically. Good morning, Mrs. Price Ridley. Good morning, Miss Weatherby. Such a warm day for June. I have been to see poor Griselda. The group swelled around her at once. Mrs. Price Ridley's handbag came down from her bosom to a position of active declaration. Miss Weatherby leaned forward as though against a strong wind, and a fourth lady, Miss Hartnell, who could not be dislodged from any conversation once she had joined it, appeared at the pavement's edge with the unassailable smile of a woman who has come in possession of new information. It was the postman, Miss Hartnell announced without preamble. The postman saw him, at 9:30 last evening, going up the drive. A gentleman in a dark coat. Not one of ours. Not one of ours, repeated Mrs. Price Ridley, with the solemnity of a citation. And, Miss Hartnell continued, Mrs. Bunn at the Blue Boar has said, and I have this from Mrs. Bunn herself, so it is not gossip, that a stranger took a room the night before last, paid for 2 nights, and has not been seen since yesterday morning. A murmur passed through the little cluster like a wave. Miss Marple lifted her handbag a fraction of an inch and set it down again, which was the equivalent from her of great excitement. 2 nights, she said thoughtfully. How very interesting. And has the gentleman a name? He signed as Mr. Ellis, said Miss Hartnell, with something very close to a triumphant tremor. Only Mrs. Bunn says his hand shook when he wrote it, as though he had forgotten what name he had meant to use. Mr. Ellis, murmured Miss Marple. She was silent for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she said, still in the mildest possible voice, How curiously close that is to Ellen. The 4 ladies stopped speaking altogether. Even the hydrangea appeared to lean in. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose handbag descended once more, said sharply, Ellen? Who is Ellen? Oh, no one that I know of, said Miss Marple. It is a name I heard mentioned. Probably nothing at all. Do go on, Miss Hartnell. I did not mean to interrupt. Miss Hartnell, who had never in her life been prevented from going on, went on. The stranger, it transpired, had been of medium height, a little grey at the temples, well dressed but tired, with the sort of face that had once been handsome and had since had a great deal of trouble upon it. Mrs. Bunn had thought him a solicitor. Mr. Bunn had thought him a widower. The kitchen maid had thought him a gentleman with a sorrow, which, as Miss Hartnell observed, was a very kitchen-maid thing to think, but perhaps not, in this case, an inaccurate one. Meanwhile, in the parlour of the old rectory, Inspector Slack was subjecting a second parlour theory to less picturesque examination. He had drawn from Miss Halliwell's desk a small stack of correspondence bound with a green ribbon. He had also drawn from her housekeeper, Mrs. Dagg, an account of her mistress's last 24 hours that included, with unusual precision, a mention of a telephone call at 6 in the evening, a call which had left Miss Halliwell, said Mrs. Dagg, as white as her own linen. And after this call, Slack pressed, did she say anything? She said, sir, only one thing. She said, after all these years. And then she said, I shall need my writing case. And I brought her the writing case, and she sat down at the desk in the drawing room. And that was where. Mrs. Dagg dissolved into a handkerchief, and Inspector Slack, who had a reasonable, if impatient, kindness in him, waited until she could speak again. Behind him, Colonel Bantry was examining the 2 halves of the torn photograph, as though sheer intensity of gaze might induce the girl in the Sunday hat to speak her surname. Back on the high street, Miss Marple detached herself from the gossiping cluster with the delicate art of a woman who has been detaching herself from such clusters for half a century. She crossed the road, ostensibly to purchase half a pound of butter, actually to think. The village was building its faulty theories with cheerful speed. Mr. Ellis at the Blue Boar, a dark coat on a drive, a quiet spinster arranged too precisely, a stranger with a sorrow. It was all very plausible, and Miss Marple, whose experience of village theories was long and rueful, distrusted plausibility on principle. Villages, she had often reflected, produced stories the way hedgerows produced brambles, quickly, thickly, and never without thorns. She thought of the broken peony. She thought of Miss Halliwell's last words to her housekeeper, after all these years. She thought of the young woman in the Sunday hat, and the ink-faded name upon the reverse. And she thought, with the faint, almost involuntary tightening around the eyes that Griselda called her Aunt Jane look, of the fact that respectability, in a woman like Miss Halliwell, was rarely ornamental for its own sake. Respectability of that intensity was almost always the covering over of something else. Not always something guilty, sometimes only something grieved, but something. At the corner of the butcher's, she almost walked into Mr. Enderby, the parish clerk, who was going the other way at speed. "Oh, Miss Marple, I beg your pardon." "Not at all, Mr. Enderby. You are in a great hurry." "I am to fetch the register, ma'am. The inspector wishes to consult the marriage register for 1908. 1908, said Miss Marple. "How very particular. And, Mr. Enderby, if it is not indelicate, the photograph. You saw the photograph." Mr. Enderby paused. His paper-coloured face grew, if possible, one shade paler. He glanced up the lane in the direction of the old rectory, then down toward the church, then back at Miss Marple. "I saw it, ma'am. The girl in the Sunday hat." "And?" He lowered his voice. "Miss Marple, I do not think I ought to say, but the face—" "Yes, Mr. Enderby?" "The face," he said, almost inaudibly, "was the face of a young woman who, so far as I know, has been dead these 50 years. Or ought to have been." He hurried on, leaving Miss Marple standing very still upon the pavement, the butter forgotten, and the second gentle tilt of the teacup begun. Section 3. Inspector Slack chooses the nearest door. Miss Marple did not immediately move from the corner of the butcher's. She stood with her handbag settled against her forearm, watching Mr. Enderby's coat-tails vanish round the wall of the churchyard, and she permitted herself, briefly, the luxury of doing nothing but thinking. A woman dead 50 years, whose face lived on in a torn photograph, in a drawing-room where another woman had been killed by a mark no larger than a pinprick. After all these years. Ellen, 1908. Numbers, thought Miss Marple, were like flowers. Some were pretty and meant nothing, some were plain and meant everything. She began to walk, slowly, in the direction of the police motor car which had appeared at the old rectory gate. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had abandoned the drawing-room for the study, where he was pacing in front of a bookshelf with the fixed expression of a man who has decided upon a suspect and does not intend to be dissuaded by facts. His decision was Mr. Ellis. It was a decision founded upon 3 excellent principles. 1. Mr. Ellis was a stranger. 2. Mr. Ellis had disappeared. And 3. Mr. Ellis was not on hand to argue. "A stranger takes a room," said Slack, as much to Colonel Bantry as to himself. "A stranger is seen upon the drive. A stranger vanishes. A woman is dead. It is not, Colonel, a case that will trouble the assizes for long." "Ellis," said Colonel Bantry, in his mild, retired way, "is a very common name. Common enough to be a false one, sir. Or common enough to be a true one that has been misused." Slack did not care for this observation, which struck him as the sort of thing said by men who read too many novels. He returned to the desk and began once again to sift through the little pile of correspondence bound in green ribbon. The correspondence was disappointing. There were 3 notes from the vicar, all concerning the flower rota, 2 from the Halliwell family solicitor, both concerning the reinvestment of a small annuity, and a single letter, dated some 14 years earlier, from a Mrs. Marston in Torquay, thanking Miss Halliwell for "your kindness during that difficult summer." Slack turned the Marston letter this way and that. That difficult summer meant nothing to him, and he set it aside. He was less inclined to set aside the ledger. Miss Halliwell had kept a small household accounts ledger in the second drawer of her writing desk, and in it, on the last page, in a hand that had grown suddenly unsteady, she had written, the day before her death, a single line and drawn a firm underline beneath it. £40 to E, as before. "As before," Slack read aloud. "As before. So she has been paying this E before." "Regularly," said Bantry, glancing over. "Look at the previous pages." They were, indeed, there. Twice a year going back, Slack turned the pages, going back at least a decade. £40 every May, £40 every November, to E, to E, to E. "Blackmail," said Slack with satisfaction. "Blackmail, Colonel. Our stranger, our Mr. Ellis, has been bleeding her for years. She refuses at last. He comes. She dies." "Perhaps," said Bantry. "Perhaps is what juries decide, sir. I am a head of the jury." Miss Marple, entering the drawing room at that moment on the arm of the housekeeper, Mrs. Dagg, who had begged her tearfully to "sit a moment with me, ma'am, only a moment," came in upon this satisfied pronouncement and did not, at first, disturb it. She sat down beside the fireplace, folded her hands upon her lap, and let Inspector Slack complete his sentence. "It is a straightforward matter, Miss Marple," said Slack, whose respect for the old lady had been dragged up out of him by past experience against his will. "Blackmail turned to violence. Once we lay hands upon Ellis, the affair will conclude itself." "Oh, I do so hope you are right, Inspector," said Miss Marple. "It would be such a relief. It has been so warm." Slack, uncertain whether the warmth of the weather had any bearing upon the case, and half suspecting that it had, nodded and returned to his ledger. Miss Marple's eyes, meanwhile, made a very small journey around the room. They rested, for the shortest moment, upon the writing desk, upon the little brass inkwell, upon the blotter which had been used and used recently, and which bore the faint pale imprint of writing pressed into it in reverse, upon the pen which lay across the blotter rather than in its stand, upon the chair which had been pushed back a little way, as if its occupant had risen quickly, and finally upon the carpet, where a certain patch, half a foot from where Miss Halliwell had fallen, bore, if one looked very closely, and one had known that carpet for years, a slight, almost invisible dampness. Water, thought Miss Marple, or tea, or something spilt from a vase. She rose, murmuring an apology, and drifted in her drifting way towards the window. The peonies of the neighbouring garden were visible from here, glowing pink in the sun. But it was not the peonies that held her attention. It was the little side table beside the window, upon which stood a slender crystal vase. In the vase were 3 white roses, freshly cut, freshly arranged. And on the table beside the vase was a single wet ring, where a 4th flower, or perhaps another vase, had lately stood. "Mrs. Dagg," said Miss Marple without turning, "were there 4 roses in that vase this morning?" Mrs. Dagg looked up, her handkerchief pressed against her nose. "4? Oh no, ma'am. The mistress never cut more than 3 at once. It was a rule of hers. 3 white from the bush by the sundial. She said it was more elegant." "Then this ring," said Miss Marple softly, "was made by something else." Slack, who had drifted toward the window at the sound of her voice, looked at the ring without interest. "A glass, perhaps, or a small dish. Nothing to signify." "Nothing to signify," Miss Marple agreed, and inclined her head in the polite manner of a woman who has been told the sky is not blue. She returned to her seat. The rest of the morning passed in the ordinary rituals of an early investigation. Statements were taken from Mrs. Dagg, from the postman, from Mrs. Bunn at the Blue Boar. A young constable was dispatched to trace Mr. Ellis. The doctor, called back for a second examination, confirmed that the pinprick at the base of Miss Halliwell's neck was consistent with the injection of a substance which, though not yet identified, was almost certainly rapid in its action. "Injection," said Slack, gratified. "A syringe, not the tool of a passing tramp, the tool of a man who has planned. Mr. Ellis, once again, thank you." Miss Marple, on her way at last out of the old rectory, paused in the hall to admire the umbrella stand, an item which had held her attention, one might have thought, disproportionately long. There were 2 umbrellas in it, and a walking stick with a silver handle. The silver handle was engraved, faintly, with initials that had been worn nearly away. H.E. "What an unusual walking stick," said Miss Marple. "Do you know, Mrs. Dagg, whose it was?" "Oh, that, ma'am. That was Miss Halliwell's father's. He was a Halliwell, of course, but his mother's name was Elwood, and the stick was hers before him. She had it engraved with her own initials as a girl, H.E., long before her marriage. Miss Halliwell would never part with it." "H.E.," murmured Miss Marple. "Elwood. How very interesting." She stepped out into the sunlight. Behind her, Inspector Slack was already at the telephone, dictating a description of a non-existent Mr. Ellis to a non-existent train station clerk in a neighbouring town. Miss Marple, walking back down the lane, watched a wood pigeon settle on the churchyard yew and thought about names, about Ellen and Ellis and Elwood, and how remarkable it was that murderers so frequently could not bear to give themselves a false name that had nothing to do with the true one. How the false name was almost always a shadow of the true, cast from the same little private lantern. She thought also that Inspector Slack, in choosing Mr. Ellis, had chosen the nearest door, the door that had opened most conveniently, and that the nearest door, in her experience, was almost never the right one. It was the door that had been left ajar precisely to catch a man like Inspector Slack. She reached her own garden gate at exactly 12:15 and stood there a moment before going in, listening to a bee in the honeysuckle. Somewhere in the village, she felt, a person of very considerable respectability was drinking a cup of tea with hands that trembled only very slightly, having placed a syringe or a small phial where nobody would think to look. Section 4. Mr. Ellis, who wore a tired coat. Miss Marple did not linger long at her gate. The bee in the honeysuckle went about its business. She went about hers. Once inside, she laid her handbag upon the hall table, drew her cardigan a little tighter than the weather required, and sat down in the parlour with a piece of unfinished knitting in her lap. The knitting was for the vicar's youngest, but that afternoon Miss Marple worked, if she was honest, less at the wool than at the tangle in her mind. She had scarcely completed one row when there was a knock at the door. It was Griselda, come with news, followed within a minute by Colonel Bantry, come with more, and within 20 minutes the parlour had assembled a small, unofficial court. Griselda perched on the arm of the sofa, Colonel Bantry pacing between the window and the hearth, and Miss Marple, hands quiet on her knitting, listening. "They've found him," said Bantry. "Or rather, they've been found by him, which is not quite the same. Mr. Ellis walked into the police station of his own accord at 11 o'clock. He said he had heard, at the Blue Boar, that they were looking for him." "And what," said Miss Marple mildly, "did Mr. Ellis have to say?" "He said his name is not Ellis. He said his name is Harold Marston." "Marston," murmured Miss Marple, and her needles paused, though only for the length of one breath. "From Torquay?" Bantry looked at her sharply. "How did you know?" "There was a letter," she said. "A letter Inspector Slack showed me, or rather, laid within reach and did not conceal. From a Mrs. Marston in Torquay, thanking Miss Halliwell for her kindness during a difficult summer." "That," said Bantry, "is precisely what Mr. Marston has now confirmed. Mrs. Marston was his mother. The difficult summer was the summer his father died, when he was 14. Miss Halliwell, it seems, had known his family since before he was born. She had helped his mother financially. She had paid, quietly, for the boy's schooling." "Then he did not come to blackmail her?" "He says not. He says he came, on the contrary, to warn her." Griselda, who had been holding her breath, released it in a little rush. "Warn her?" Miss Marple repeated. "Of what?" "Of a letter," said Bantry, "which his mother had received some months ago, and which, with her dying, so to speak, in mind, she had given him to keep and to act upon. The letter was old, very old. His mother would not part with it in life, but in death she wished it destroyed, and yet not destroyed before Miss Halliwell had been told what it contained. He came to St. Mary Mead to tell her." "And what," said Miss Marple, "did the letter contain?" Bantry hesitated. He glanced at Griselda, at the door, at Miss Marple's serene grey head bent again over the knitting. "It was written," he said finally, "in 1908. It was written by a young woman named Ellen. It was written to Miss Cordelia Halliwell, who was then, of course, a girl of 18. And it was a letter of warning. It said, in effect, 'Do not let them do what they mean to do. Do not let them silence me. If I disappear, remember that I was not willing to go.'" The parlour for a moment contained no sound but the shifting of Miss Marple's wool. "Ellen," she said softly. "Ellen Elwood, one wonders." "How," said Bantry in something like exasperation, "do you do it, Miss Marple?" "The walking stick," she said, "in the umbrella stand. Engraved H.E., Miss Halliwell's grandmother, Mrs. Dagg told me." Elwood was the maiden name. If there was an Ellen in that family 50 years ago, it seemed to me an Ellen was rather likely to be an Ellen Elwood. And you were sent, I think, Colonel Bantry, or Inspector Slack was, to the marriage register for 1908. Was there an Ellen Elwood in it? There was not, said Bantry. There was, however, a burial register. Ah. Ellen Elwood, aged 19, was buried in this churchyard in September 1908. Cause of death recorded as sudden decline. She was the younger cousin of Cordelia Halliwell and had been living at the old rectory that summer. Sudden decline, Miss Marple murmured. How very Edwardian. Griselda whispered, What does that mean, Aunt Jane? It means, my dear, whatever the doctor of the day was too polite, or too fond of the family, or too weary to write down. It might mean anything. Sometimes it meant a broken heart. Sometimes it meant a fall down a staircase. Sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, it meant a young woman who had not been willing to go. Colonel Bantry sat down heavily in the armchair opposite. Then you believe her? The letter Mr. Marston brought? I believe, said Miss Marple gently, that the letter is genuine. Whether what is in it is true, that is quite another matter. Young women of 19 have, on occasion, been dramatic. Nevertheless, someone in this village killed Miss Halliwell yesterday evening, and the murderer was not, I am sorry to say, a man in a tired coat come from Torquay. How, Bantry demanded, can you be so certain? Because, said Miss Marple, Mr. Marston, or Mr. Ellis as he was calling himself, arrived by train 2 evenings ago and was in the Blue Boar's parlour in full view of Mrs. Bunn and the kitchen maid from 6 o'clock until nearly 10. That was Miss Hartnell's report, by the way, though Miss Hartnell did not know she was reporting it. The kitchen maid's young man was mending the fire in the parlour throughout. He was seen. He was watched. And the pinprick, the injection, must, according to Dr. Haydock's judgment, have been administered somewhere between 6 and 8, since it was so rapid in action. Mr. Marston cannot have been in Miss Halliwell's drawing-room at 6 or 7. He was drinking a pint of bitter under Mrs. Bunn's eye. Bantry stared. Then who? Someone, said Miss Marple, who did not need to travel. Someone who could walk to the old rectory in a matter of minutes, be admitted without alarm, sit down for a glass of something, and leave again by an ordinary door with an ordinary umbrella. Someone Miss Halliwell was pleased to see, or at least not shocked to see. Someone whom she had been paying £40 twice a year for many years. Someone who is called E in her ledger, but who is not, I think, called E at all. E is only what she wrote when she did not want to write the name. Griselda whispered, Then who is E? That, said Miss Marple, taking up her knitting again with perfect composure, is the small, unpleasant task I shall have to set myself this afternoon. I fear it may involve calling upon 2 or 3 people who would rather not be called upon. She had not, however, quite finished with Mr. Marston. Colonel Bantry, she said, would you do a very great kindness and ask that poor man to come and take tea with me tomorrow? At 4. It would perhaps do him good, and it would certainly do me good. I shall ask him, Bantry said. I fancy he will be glad to come. He looked, when I saw him, like a man who had been carrying a coffin for a long way. He has been carrying a coffin for a long way, said Miss Marple. A very small one, his mother's, and now he must set it down. They went. Griselda, at the door, paused and looked back. Aunt Jane, the pinprick. If Miss Halliwell was killed with an injection, she must have let the person close to her, mustn't she? Very close. Yes, my dear. Then it was somebody she trusted. Yes, my dear. Somebody respectable. Yes, my dear. Miss Marple's needles paused once again. That is what makes it so very bad. Respectability, you see, is often the last cloak a person will consent to lay down, even to be hanged in. At the old rectory that afternoon, Inspector Slack was reluctantly obliged to admit that his convenient Mr. Ellis was neither guilty nor Ellis. He did so with the ill grace of a man from whom a favourite theory has been prized. He then, with the resilience of the professionally aggrieved, began to look about the village for the next nearest door. Miss Marple, at her window, watched the shadow of the yew tree lengthen across her lawn. She watched, in her mind, the ledger with its rows of E's. She watched a young woman named Ellen in a Sunday hat standing before a wooden gate in 1908, and she began, with the smallest tightening around the eyes, to see the shape, not yet the face, of a person who had walked for many years in and out of Miss Halliwell's drawing room without ever being asked to leave. Section 5. The Pressed Flower in the Prayer Book. The shadow of the U reached Miss Marple's doorstep at 4:30, at which hour, punctual as always, Dr. Haydock let himself in through the garden gate with the unceremonious cheer of a very old friend. He carried, in place of the customary bottle of some medical curiosity, a small oblong parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Jane," he said, "I have brought you something you will find perfectly indecent." "You always do, Dr. Haydock. Do sit down." He sat down opposite her, unwrapped the parcel with the theatrical patience of a conjurer, and laid upon the little table between them Miss Cordelia Halliwell's prayer book. It was black, worn at the corners, and its ribbon marker lay across a page in the order for the burial of the dead. "I ought not," said Haydock, "to have it. Slack does not know I have it. If he did, he would make noises. I removed it, if you must know, because I have known that prayer book since the day Cordelia was confirmed, and I did not care for it to be handled by the inspector's young men, who have honest fingers but no reverence. Also because," and here his voice quieted, "I remembered that Cordelia used to keep things in it, small things, things that mattered." Miss Marple opened the prayer book with the care of a woman opening a jewel case. Between 2 pages of the Psalter, pressed flat by 50 years and the weight of prayer, lay a peony petal. It was faded almost to brown. Beside it, folded very small, was a strip of paper. Miss Marple unfolded the paper. On it, in a young, unformed hand, was written, "If they do not stop, I shall write to Papa. I shall. Ellen, 3rd September 1908. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then she closed the prayer book with the same care and laid her hand upon it. "So," she said at last, "Ellen wished to write to her father, and she did not write. Or she did, and it did not reach him. He was in India," Haydock said quietly. "Elwood was in the Punjab that autumn. Letters were slow, and Ellen died within the fortnight." "The pressed peony," Miss Marple said. "The peony in the prayer book. And this morning, in Miss Halliwell's garden, a broken peony, picked and dropped at the very edge of the bed." "You saw that?" "Anyone would have seen it who was looking. The murderer, I think, picked it up on the way to the drawing room, perhaps in agitation, perhaps as a kind of talisman, and having reached the house, dropped it in the garden, thinking better of carrying so telling a thing indoors." "Telling?" "Peonies," said Miss Marple, "were Ellen's flower. Miss Halliwell told me once, many years ago, quite in passing, over a jumble sale stall, that peonies had been her cousin Ellen's favourite, that she, Cordelia, had planted the border after Ellen's death, and had tended it herself, without help, for half a century. It was, she said, the least she could do for the poor child. I remember thinking at the time that the least she could do was a peculiar phrase for a woman speaking of a cousin who had died of a decline, as though she owed a debt. Haydock closed his eyes. "Jane, what are you telling me?" "Nothing yet. I am telling us both what we already almost know, that a debt was owed, that the debt was paid, or seemed paid, £40 twice a year for many years, to someone Miss Halliwell wrote in her ledger as E, that the payments were not for silence about a thing Cordelia had done, for Cordelia, you and I both know, could not have hurt a fly at 18, but for silence about a thing she had seen, or a thing she had not prevented, and that yesterday, at 6 in the evening, someone telephoned her, and after that telephone call, she said to Mrs. Dagg, 'After all these years,' and she sat down at her writing desk, and she began, I think, to compose the letter she had failed to write in 1908. And her murderer came and stopped her. Her murderer came, said Miss Marple, and made sure that the letter was never finished, and that the writing case was disturbed enough for us to believe that the letter had never been begun." Haydock rose, walked to the window, and stood staring out at the U. "Jane," he said without turning, "do you know who it is?" "I know," she said, "where to look. I do not yet know the face. I shall, I think, by tomorrow evening. The next morning, being Thursday, was market day at Much Benham, and much of St Mary Mead absented itself on the 10 o'clock bus. Miss Marple, however, walked in the opposite direction. She walked up the lane past the old rectory, past the churchyard, past the paddock where the vicar's pony was being lectured by a robin, and down a rough track to a cottage of tremendous respectability and pale yellow roses. This was the cottage of Miss Emmeline Ashe, retired schoolmistress, 73 years of age, a woman whose upright silhouette had led the choir in 3 coronations and countless funerals. Miss Ashe received her upon the doorstep with the mixture of decorum and warmth to which the village had grown accustomed. She wore, as always, a grey skirt of impeccable severity, a lace collar of an era before the wars, and a small enamel brooch of a shepherdess. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure! Do come in. Poor Cordelia. Poor Cordelia." "Poor Cordelia," Miss Marple agreed, stepping into a hall which smelt of lavender polish and beeswax. They took tea in the little parlour. On the mantelpiece stood 2 silver candlesticks, a mantel clock, and a framed photograph, a school group, sepia and faded, at least 50 years old. In the front row of the school group, seated stiffly on a bench, was a young Miss Ashe of perhaps 23, in the dress of a very young teacher. Behind her, in the second row, at the very edge, half turned as though she had begun to move at the moment the shutter clicked, was a girl in a light Sunday hat. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the photograph for the length of a single unhurried heartbeat. Then they moved politely away. "Such a lovely photograph, Miss Ashe. The old school. What a good many faces one recognises." "Do you? I confess, at my age, most of them are gone to me, or gone from earth. Poor Ellen there at the back." Miss Ashe paused and set her cup down. "But I forget myself. She would have been quite unknown to you." "Ellen?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Not Ellen Elwood?" Miss Ashe's hand did not tremble. It became, instead, quite still. The stillness of a small, wary bird upon a wire. "You knew of her?" "Only in passing. Cordelia had mentioned her, once, at a jumble sale. Was she a pupil of yours, Miss Ashe?" "She was," said Miss Ashe, and picked up her cup again with hands so composed that Miss Marple was moved to admiration and to something else, less kind. "She died," Miss Ashe continued, with the calm of a woman reciting a lesson she had rehearsed. "In 1908, a sudden decline. It was a very sad summer. Cordelia, I remember, took it hard. She and I sat together in this parlour on the evening of the funeral. I did what I could to console her. One does what one can." "One does," said Miss Marple. "Such a beautiful photograph. And the pressed flower. I see there is a pressed flower in that little frame on your side table." Miss Ashe turned her head very slightly. On the side table, in a small oval frame Miss Marple had not observed until that moment, was a single pressed peony petal. It was faded to a brown that matched, exactly, the petal in Miss Halliwell's prayer book. "Yes," said Miss Ashe, "a memento, of the same poor Ellen. Cordelia gave me a petal, of a flower we had both loved. That was many years ago." "How kind of her," said Miss Marple, and drank her tea. 20 minutes later she took her leave, having spoken chiefly of the flower rota, of the choir's continuing troubles with the tenor line, and of the extraordinary heat. At the doorstep, as they parted, she paused. "Miss Ashe, forgive me for asking, but the choir practice on Tuesday evening, were you well? I only ask because Mrs. Bunn thought she saw you on the lane afterwards, in the direction of the old rectory, and I said to her, 'Surely not. Miss Ashe would have gone straight home, but of course my hearing is not what it was.'" Miss Ashe smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes. "Your hearing, dear Miss Marple, is famously excellent, but Mrs. Bunn is mistaken. I went straight home. I always do." "Of course. Do forgive me." Miss Marple walked back down the track through the roses. She did not turn her head, but she was aware, without looking, that behind one of the pale yellow blooms, at a parlour window, a pair of very still grey eyes was watching her go. The peony motif, she thought, had opened one petal further. Section 6. The Vicarage Lawn and Older Sins. Miss Marple did not turn her head, but she was aware, with the sixth sense of a woman who has spent 70 years in villages, that Miss Ash's parlour window had not lost her until the very last of the pale yellow roses. She reached the lane and, at the lane's end, exhaled a small, careful breath. She did not go home. She went to the vicarage lawn, where, as Providence and Griselda had between them arranged, the annual Church Fete Committee was meeting for the third time, and, as always, achieving less than the second. Under the great copper beech, a trestle had been unfolded. Upon the trestle stood a plate of macaroons which nobody was eating, and a pot of tea from which everybody was drinking. And around the trestle sat the usual persons, Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Weatherby, Miss Hartnell, Griselda, and, in the chair at the head, Miss Emmeline Ash, who had reached the vicarage lawn a full quarter of an hour before Miss Marple, by way of the shortcut behind the churchyard. Miss Marple noted the shortcut with polite interior amusement. Then she took her place on the wicker chair Griselda had kept for her and accepted a cup of tea. The talk was of murder, of course, but sideways, in the peculiar way of villages which mention the unmentionable by not mentioning it. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke of the dreadful atmosphere. Miss Weatherby spoke of a bad dream she had had involving crows. Miss Hartnell spoke with satisfaction of a niece in London who worked in a solicitor's office and had once, personally, seen a wax figure of Dr. Crippen. Miss Ash spoke very little. When she spoke, it was of the rota for the flower stall. "I think, Griselda, that we shall want 2 ladies at the stall on the Saturday afternoon. It is always then that the pressure comes on." "Of course, Miss Ash." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Miss Ash is such a comfort," she remarked to the table at large. "I always say, do I not, Griselda, that in a village a schoolmistress is like a hinge. Everything opens and shuts upon her. She remembers all the children. She remembers, too, whom they became." Miss Ash inclined her head gravely. "One tries to be of use." "I was reflecting only this morning," Miss Marple continued dreamily, "upon the strange way an old scandal has of surfacing. Do you remember Mrs. Price Ridley? No, of course, you would not. You came to us only after the war. But perhaps Miss Ash remembers the sad affair of the Duttons' nursemaid. Now that must have been 30 years ago at the least. She was accused, poor girl, of stealing a bracelet and was cast out of the village in disgrace. It was 10 years before it came out that the bracelet had been mislaid by Mrs. Dutton herself in a hat box in the attic. The girl by then was dead of typhoid in Liverpool. It always struck me as a very hard thing. There was a small murmur of sympathy. "Villages," said Miss Marple, "are so very good at deciding a thing in an afternoon, and being wrong about it for 50 years. Miss Ash, who had lifted her cup, set it down again. Her hand did not tremble. "Villages are also," said Miss Ash quietly, "very good, on occasion, at holding a decent silence over things that are best not spoken of. There is virtue in that too, Miss Marple, though it is less fashionable to say so." "Oh, undoubtedly," said Miss Marple. "Silence is often kindness. Sometimes, though," she paused, and her pale eyes seemed for a moment to look through Miss Ash and past her to something a great distance away. "Sometimes it is not kindness. It is the doing of a bill that must be paid, eventually, by a person who has done nothing to deserve the debt." Miss Weatherby, missing the point altogether, said, "What lovely macaroons." Miss Ash rose then, with the natural grace of a woman rising to move a chair, and moved a chair. That evening Mr. Harold Marston came to tea at Miss Marple's. He was a man of 40 or so, thin at the temples, kind of eye, with the tired coat the village had marked. He sat in her parlour with his knees drawn together and his cup upon them, and he told her the story of his mother's difficult summer. "I was 14, he said. My father had died in the March. There was no money. My mother wrote to Miss Halliwell. She had been a governess in her girlhood to Cordelia. Miss Halliwell wrote back at once and enclosed a cheque. She wrote every month thereafter. She paid for my school. I never met her. But when my mother lay dying in March of this year, she gave me a letter. She said, 'This is Ellen's letter.' Ellen was my friend. She wrote it the night before she died. She gave it to me, and I hid it, and I have never known what to do with it. I could not destroy it. Now I am dying, and it must go back to Cordelia. Cordelia must know that Ellen did not go willingly." He put his cup down. His hand did not tremble either. Everyone in this business, thought Miss Marple, had steady hands. It was a bad sign. So I came. I wrote to Miss Halliwell first, from London, 3 weeks ago. I said I had a letter of her cousin Ellen's to bring her, and I would come at her convenience. She wrote back at once and said, "Come on the 11th. Come at 7 o'clock in the evening. Come by the garden door, and let no one see you." And so you were coming, on the evening of her death at 7 o'clock, by the garden door. Yes. You did not, however, arrive. He looked at her steadily. I did arrive, Miss Marple. I arrived at 7, and I found the garden door already open, and I saw, from the garden, that there was a figure at Miss Halliwell's desk in the drawing-room, seated in her chair, quite still. I thought it was Miss Halliwell. I did not go in. I turned. I walked back to the Blue Boar. I did not know until the next morning that she was dead. You saw a figure. You did not see the face. I saw only a back in dark grey, a woman's back. I assumed, because who else could it be, that it was Miss Halliwell herself, and that I was too early, or she was preoccupied. I withdrew. Miss Marple was quiet for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she said, with immense gentleness, "Mr. Marston, did you notice, when you turned to go, whether there was anything upon the garden path?" "There was," he said. "I did not think of it until this moment. There was a peony. It had been picked and dropped. I nearly trod on it." "And the light?" "The light in the drawing-room was low. Miss Halliwell, the figure, had lit only the small green-shaded lamp on the desk." "Not the ceiling lamp?" "No." "Did the figure move at all while you watched?" Mr. Marston frowned. "Yes, it moved once. It reached out toward the little side table by the window, toward a vase, I think, and it took something from the vase, and then it laid the thing on the desk. I remember thinking, what a fastidious woman to be arranging her flowers even now." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "What is it?" he said. "The 4th rose," said Miss Marple, "or rather, not the 4th rose, but the file. She, Miss Halliwell, had habitually kept in her vase, hidden among the stems, a small file. It was where she hid, all these years, the little private things her housekeeper was not to see. Letters once, and now perhaps other things. And the figure at the desk knew of the file, and took it, and having taken it, was gone within the minute, by which time you had already turned back down the garden path. Then I saw the murderer." "You saw the back of the murderer, in the dusk, from a garden, through a lace curtain. It is a mercy, I say this with great care, that you did not see the face. Otherwise, Mr. Marston, you would not now be having tea with me." He was silent. "You must," said Miss Marple, "stay another night at the Blue Boar. You must not walk in the lanes after dark. You must, tomorrow morning, give Inspector Slack this exact account. And you must not, on any account, mention peonies." "Why?" "Because peonies," said Miss Marple, "are, at this moment, the only thing between us and the murderer's composure, and I am extremely anxious not to shake that composure until the very last minute." He rose and thanked her and went. Miss Marple watched him down the lane, then closed her door, and sat for a long time by the fire without lighting the lamp. Older sins, she was thinking. Older sins, and a hinge in a village, and a schoolmistress who had never in her life lost her hand's stillness. There were things in respectable people, she knew, that lay very deep, deeper than blackmail, deeper than money. Sometimes the worst of them was pride. She would test that pride, she thought, tomorrow. Section 7. The second shock in the churchyard. Miss Marple did not sleep well. Twice in the night she woke to the sound, or the imagined sound, of feet upon the lane, and twice she lay listening until the wood-pigeon began, at 4:30, its patient morning complaint. At 5 she rose. By 6 she had drunk 1 cup of tea. By 7 she had knitted a full inch of the vicar's youngest's cardigan. At 7:30 the telephone rang, and it was Griselda, breathless, saying only, "Aunt Jane, come! At the churchyard! Please come!" Miss Marple was in her hat and cardigan within 4 minutes. She went by the shortcut behind the vicarage, and thereby reached the churchyard gate at the same instant as Colonel Bantry, panting from the opposite direction. They looked at each other, said nothing, and went in together. At the foot of the great yew, where the older graves lay in their moss and their gentle disrepair, a small figure had fallen. It was face down upon the grass, with one arm flung forward, as though reaching toward the stone. The stone was old and slate-grey. Its legend, half worn away, read, "Ellen Elwood, 1889-1908, she sleeps in peace." The figure at the foot of the stone was Miss Emmeline Ashe. She was dead. There was upon her upper lip a faint blueness, as of a woman who has not been able to catch her breath. Her lace collar had gone askew. In her clenched right hand, Miss Marple, kneeling, opened the fingers with great gentleness, was a peony petal, freshly picked from someone's garden, still pink, still cold with dew. Colonel Bantry drew in a very slow breath. "Miss Marple, this is—" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The pinprick, do you think—" "There will be no pinprick," said Miss Marple quietly. She had not risen from her knees. She was studying the fallen collar, the slightly disarranged hair, the small silver brooch of the shepherdess still fastened to the blouse. "There will be, I think, something taken by mouth, something in a cup of tea perhaps, an hour ago. She has been dying since she came out of doors. She walked here, and she reached the stone, and she fell." Then she was killed?" "I do not know, Colonel Bantry." Miss Marple's voice was very even. "I do not know whether she was killed or whether she came here to die." He stared at her. "It is quite possible," Miss Marple went on, still looking down at Miss Ashe, "that she was killed. It is quite possible that she was not. I shall not know which until Dr. Haydock has looked at her, and then perhaps not even then. But whichever it is, this, Colonel, this is the second shock, and it has been most carefully arranged." "Arranged?" "The peony in the hand," she said, "the stone at her feet, the choice of hour, no, do not touch, only look, the choice of hour, when the sexton is at his breakfast and the village at its kettles, so that she should be found by us and not by a stranger. Also, the choice of victim. Whoever has done this, or whoever has permitted this, has been thinking all night of how it should look." Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes. He arrived with the aggrieved and heavy step of a man whose theory of Mr. Ellis had, in the course of a single day, to give way to a theory of Miss Ashe, and whose theory of Miss Ashe was now going to have to give way to something else, and who had not yet been told what. He took one look at Miss Ashe and said, "Suicide." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Guilt," said Slack, gathering steam. "She murdered Miss Halliwell. She was seen upon the lane on Tuesday. Mrs. Bunn thought so, at any rate. She has now taken her own life, in remorse, at the grave of her own long-buried victim. It is Greek. It is neat. It is the case, ladies and gentlemen, and I do not mind saying so." "Oh, Inspector," said Miss Marple mildly, "I am sure I hope so. It would be very tidy." Slack, who had learned to fear Miss Marple's hopes, gave her a suspicious sideways look and set his young men to their measurements. Dr. Haydock, brought from his breakfast, examined the body. He rose from his knees and looked at Miss Marple with the particular expression that had, over the years, come to mean between them a great deal. "Aconite," he said. "I would stake something on it. In her tea, most probably. Not more than an hour ago. She was walking, she felt it. She reached this stone and fell." "Aconite," said Miss Marple. "How very Edwardian." Slack, hearing this, said, "What?" rather sharply. But Miss Marple only tightened the strap of her handbag and asked of Colonel Bantry, "Might we, do you think, look at Miss Ashe's cottage? I feel it would tell us a great deal." They went, the three of them, up the lane, past the churchyard yew, past the paddock. The pale yellow roses were still on the cottage front. The door was on the latch. Miss Marple pushed it open. The parlour was as it had been on the previous afternoon. The silver candlesticks, the mantel clock, the school photograph. On the little table beside the armchair stood a cup of tea, half drunk. The tea was cold. Beside the cup lay a single sheet of writing paper, folded once. In the grate a fire had been laid but not lit. In the fender were the black, curled remains of 2 or 3 pieces of burnt paper which had been thrust in and set alight before the fuel above them had caught. Someone had wished to burn something in a hurry. Miss Marple picked up the folded sheet from the table. She read it aloud. "I cannot bear it. I cannot bear the return of Ellen's letter into this house. Cordelia's death is on my conscience. I was there. I was in her house at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening. It was I who took the file from the vase. I have wronged both Ellen and Cordelia, and now I go to Ellen's grave to make what small amends I can. E.A. The handwriting was Miss Ash's, but somewhat looser than her ordinary hand, the hand of a woman writing at speed, or of a woman whose hand had been guided. "There, Miss Marple," said Slack, with a satisfaction that was almost triumph. "There, a confession. In her own hand. She has poisoned Miss Halliwell. She has poisoned herself. She has left us her note. It is finished." "Almost," said Miss Marple. "Almost, madam." "Almost. Only 2 small things trouble me, Inspector. May I show you?" She led him not to the writing table but to the fender, and she stooped with the aid of Colonel Bantry's arm and drew from the curled cinders with the fire tongs one fragment of paper not entirely burnt. It was blackened at the edges, but the centre had survived. Upon it, in the same hand as the note in the parlour, were the words, "Forgive me for what I did not do." Slack stared at the fragment. Yes, part of the confession, torn up, thrown on the fire, changed her mind. Of course. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Only, Inspector, one does not usually burn one's confession and then write a fair copy of it and place it upon the table for the police. One usually does the opposite." Slack's mouth opened and closed. "And the second small thing," Miss Marple continued, without triumph, "is the teacup." She led him to the little side table. "1 cup," said Slack. "Half drunk. Aconite." "1 cup," Miss Marple agreed. "Half drunk. And beside it, no teapot." "What?" "There is no teapot on the table, Inspector. There is no teapot in the kitchen either. I glanced in as we passed. There is a kettle, but a cold one. A woman who intends to poison herself with her own tea does not, having brewed it in a pot, then wash the pot, dry it, replace it upon the dresser, and then sit down to drink her cup and die. She simply drinks and dies, and the pot is at her elbow. Someone has been in this cottage this morning, Inspector, after Miss Ash drank her tea. Someone has removed the pot. Someone has laid this note upon the table. Someone, indeed, may have poured that tea for her, the second cup of the morning, sat opposite her while she drank it, waited with her until she began to feel unwell, and then, when she was persuaded to walk to the churchyard to make what amends she could, followed her only so far as the gate before returning to clean up." Colonel Bantry said, "Good God!" Slack, more slowly, said, "Then, the confession." "Dictated, I imagine," said Miss Marple. "Not forged. She wrote it. She wrote it under the persuasion of a person whom she had reason both to trust and to fear. She wrote it because, I think, she believed at the last that she deserved to be punished. Only she was to be punished for the wrong crime. She was punished this morning for the murder of Cordelia Halliwell. She was, in truth, guilty of nothing but a silence 50 years old. The peony petal in Miss Ash's hand, Miss Marple did not touch. She only looked at it a long moment and thought, "The motif has sharpened. There are now 2 petals. One is 50 years old and pressed. The other is fresh and was placed in a dead woman's hand by a person who wished to make quite sure that we understood what she had died of. That person, therefore, has begun to make mistakes, and that person, at this moment, believes we are looking exactly the wrong way." Section 8. Miss Marple sets a little trap. That person at this moment, believing that we were looking exactly the wrong way, was, Miss Marple felt certain, drinking a second cup of tea at that very hour in a garden not more than half a mile off, with a hand entirely steady. She meant to spoil that steadiness before the afternoon post. She did not, however, hurry. Hurrying at 70-odd was neither dignified nor efficient. She went first, with Colonel Bantry, back to her own house, where she made him a cup of coffee, for he had not yet had his breakfast, and while he drank it, she wrote, on a small correspondence card, an invitation. Dear Mrs. Price Ridley, if you would be so very kind as to call upon me this afternoon at 3:30, I should be most grateful. There is a small matter of the Fate flower stall on which I should welcome your particular judgment. Miss Weatherby and Miss Hartnell will also be coming. Miss Ashe was to have been the fourth, and in her sad absence I must ask you to stand for her. Yours most sincerely, Jane Marple. She wrote 3 such cards, altering only the name and the flattering middle sentence, for one must always flatter Mrs. Price Ridley, and one must always flatter, differently, Miss Weatherby, and one must always flatter, differently again, Miss Hartnell. Then she rose, adjusted her cardigan, and dispatched Griselda, when Griselda arrived at the door, with the 3 cards in her basket. Aunt Jane, said Griselda, what are you doing? I am asking 3 ladies to tea, in the memory of a 4th. Mr. Marston will also be there, in the little back parlour, out of sight but not out of hearing. And Colonel Bantry will be at the garden gate with, I hope, one of Inspector Slack's young men. Ask Colonel Bantry to bring the young man discreetly. And what will happen? I intend, said Miss Marple, to speak in a certain way about a certain thing. And I intend to watch a certain hand. Whose? I shall tell you afterwards, my dear. Please go. Griselda went. Miss Marple, alone again, opened her writing desk. She took out her own small volume of Christina Rossetti, in which, for she had learnt long ago not to keep dangerous notes in unlocked drawers, she had placed, that morning, one further piece of information. It was a note in Dr. Haydock's hand, delivered by his housemaid an hour ago, and it said only, Dear Jane, Ash's will. Left everything to the church except one item, viz., her school photograph album, which was to go to a Miss H. She never had a Miss H. It puzzled me. H. Miss H, thought Miss Marple, a Miss H. That is not a very difficult riddle if one is willing to be shocked. Not Halliwell, whom Miss Ashe had known as Cordelia and would have named as such. Not Hartnell, whose collection of photograph albums already surpassed any in the county. Not the vicar's wife. Then who? A Miss H. She sat a moment. Then she rose and crossed to the little bookshelf in her hall and took down the parish register her nephew Raymond had once, for a joke, transcribed for her when he was studying at Cambridge. She turned the pages. Ah, she said, aloud, to the empty hall. Yes. The 3 ladies came at 3:30. Mrs. Price Ridley came in her second best hat, Miss Weatherby in her best, Miss Hartnell in what appeared to be her third best, but was, upon closer examination, her second best, worn without its usual embellishment, out of respect for Miss Ashe. Miss Marple received them in the parlour, where the tea was already laid, thin sandwiches of cucumber and egg, a plate of shortbread, and, on a little side plate, 3 white roses in a slender crystal vase. Oh, said Miss Weatherby, sitting down. White roses? How very appropriate. I thought so, said Miss Marple. 3, as Miss Halliwell always liked. She had a great feeling, you know, for 3 white roses. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had feelings only for things she had understood in the last 5 minutes, said, Very pretty. Now, Miss Marple, about the flower stall. Presently, Mrs. Price Ridley. I hope you will forgive me. Before we come to the stall, I feel I must say a word or two about poor Miss Ashe, and about poor Miss Halliwell, and about a very old and very sad matter which I fear has come home to us at last. The 3 ladies leaned forward. Miss Marple, with the gentlest possible manner, poured out the tea. You may all of you have heard, she said, of a young woman named Ellen Elwood, who was buried in our churchyard in 1908. She was cousin to Cordelia, and lodged at the old rectory that summer. She died, the register says, of a sudden decline. She was engaged at the time, though the engagement was not known to her cousin Cordelia. Miss Weatherby said, Engaged? Ellen Elwood engaged? To a young curate, said Miss Marple, who came for 1 summer only. He was afterwards sent up to a parish in the north. Mrs. Price Ridley said, But Miss Marple, this is quite fresh news. Where have you had it? From the parish register, and from a note by our late vicar of that year, which he left in the margin of the burial book. It is not, I think, generally known. Not generally known. Miss Hartnell echoed faintly, as though the very phrase were bruised. Now, Miss Marple continued, the poor young curate. He fell out of favour with the family. Cordelia's father, Mr. Halliwell, would not hear of him. He was thought unsuitable, not enough money, not enough family, and a way of holding an opinion that Mr. Halliwell disliked. Ellen, being a poor cousin without a father in England, was less easy to shield than a daughter. She was, in short, one is sorry to say, sent away. Only, before she could be sent, she was overtaken by her sudden decline. "You mean—" Miss Weatherby breathed. "I mean nothing yet, my dear." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I only recount what was written down at the time. Ellen died. The curate, this is my point, the curate had by then been dispatched to the north. He knew nothing until he read of her death in a newspaper some weeks afterwards. He wrote, they say, one letter to the Halliwells, saying that if he ever learnt she had been ill-used, he would return and lay the matter before God and the county. He was answered by Mr. Halliwell in one line, 'There is nothing to lay.' And there, for 50 years, the matter has rested." She paused. She reached for the crystal vase. She adjusted, very slightly, the 3 white roses. "I have been considering," she said without looking up. "What became of the young curate? He died, I understand, in 1932, in a parish near Durham. He left, I believe, one child, a daughter. She would be, by now, a lady of some 60 years. Around the tea-table nothing stirred. Miss Marple raised her eyes softly and passed them across the 3 faces before her. Mrs. Price Ridley was staring, as she always stared, with the unfocused indignation of a woman who has been robbed of her own conversation. Miss Weatherby's hand had gone to her throat and remained there, tremulous as a moth. Miss Hartnell, in the 3rd chair, had lifted her teacup and held it very still, exactly halfway to her mouth. Her wrist did not move. Her fingers did not move. Her face wore the same firm smile it had worn upon arrival. Only her eyes, for one instant, had gone entirely blank, as though a shutter had passed across them and been drawn up again. "What a curious story," Miss Hartnell said, after the smallest possible pause. Her voice was steady. "How well you tell it, Miss Marple. Do go on. Did the daughter, the poor girl in the north, ever come south, I wonder?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that perhaps she did. I think she may even have come to St. Mary Mead." "Fancy," said Miss Hartnell. The teacup did not tremble. It merely began, the smallest fraction of an inch, to descend. Miss Hartnell, having descended it, set it upon the table without a click. "I must," she said, "beg your pardon, Miss Marple. I have suddenly remembered, my washerwoman comes at 4. I must be at home to receive her. Do forgive me. The flower stall, Mrs. Price Ridley will decide as she thinks best." She rose. Her handbag was at her wrist. Her hat was upon her head. Her lace collar was as neat as when she had come in. She had, in her descent from the tea-table to the door, the perfect composure of a woman who has spent her life making sure that no one, ever, sees her fall. Miss Marple did not attempt to detain her. Miss Marple rose politely, saw her to the door, and stood a moment upon the doorstep as Miss Hartnell went down the path. At the garden gate, quietly, Colonel Bantry stepped aside. He did not speak. His young man behind him, a young man in an ill-fitting brown suit, who had a way of looking uninteresting on purpose, took a single note upon a small pad and put the pad away. Miss Hartnell passed them both with her chin up. She did not look at them. She had not seen them. They were not there. Miss Marple closed her front door and returned to the parlour. Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby were staring at her with astonishment. "Do sit down, my dears," said Miss Marple. "We shall have our tea, and we shall speak of the flower stall, and after that I must speak, I fear, to Inspector Slack. Miss Hartnell has just told me, without saying a word, a great deal that I had almost, but not quite, worked out for myself, and she has told it me by the one thing she did not do. She did not tremble." "Not tremble?" said Mrs. Price Ridley. "But, Miss Marple, surely one does not condemn a lady of the parish for keeping her hand steady." "One condemns her," said Miss Marple, "not for keeping her hand steady, but for keeping it steady at the wrong moment. The story I told, my dears, would have shaken any innocent listener who had cared for Cordelia and admired Miss Ashe. Miss Weatherby, you nearly dropped your cup. Mrs. Price Ridley, you were speechless. And speechlessness in you is a form of great emotion. Miss Hartnell held her cup at exactly the height and angle at which it was when I began the sentence about the curate's daughter, and she held it there for the whole 4 seconds of my last 3 words. She held it there, my dears, because she had heard the sentence coming and had ordered her hand not to answer. The hand obeyed, but the eye is harder to command than the hand. Section 9. The Assembly of Small True Things. The eye is harder to command than the hand, and the hand is harder to command than the memory. Miss Marple, having closed her door upon Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby some quarter of an hour later, sat down at her writing desk, and in her small, firm script began to set out, one below the other, the small, true things. The peony broken in Miss Halliwell's border, and the peony pressed in her prayer book. The vase of 3 white roses, and the ring on the side table where a file had stood. The green-shaded lamp on the desk, and the back seen through the lace curtain at 7 o'clock. The ledger with its twice-yearly £40 to E. The letter from Ellen, dated 3rd September 1908, hidden in the Psalter. The father in India. The curate sent north. Ellen's sudden decline. The walking stick engraved H.E. standing in the umbrella stand for 50 years. Mrs. Marston in Torquay, kept quiet with charity. Mr. Marston at 14, taken in and paid for. Mr. Marston at 40, come with his mother's deathbed letter. Miss Ashe at the school photograph, seated stiffly in the front row, with Ellen at the back turning half away. Miss Ashe at the graveside, with a fresh peony petal in her hand. The teacup and the missing teapot. The confession written in Miss Ashe's hand, and burnt only in part, and the fair copy laid upon the table. The bequest of a photograph album to a Miss H. Miss Hartnell, whose teacup did not tremble. Miss Hartnell, whose father Miss Marple opened, upon her desk, Raymond's transcribed parish register, and read the entry aloud in her head, had been baptized in a parish near Durham, whose mother had been a housemaid before her marriage, and whose father had, in a note beside the baptism, been recorded as the Reverend J. Hartnell, curate of this parish, transferred from the Diocese of Salisbury, 1909. Salisbury, thought Miss Marple. Saint. Mary Mead lay in the Diocese of Salisbury, transferred from it, that is to say, sent away. In 1909, the year after Ellen Elwood's death. She sat still. She permitted herself to see the whole shape. The curate, Ellen's young man, sent north in 1908 after Mr. Halliwell's displeasure, reads of Ellen's death in a newspaper, writes his one letter, is answered, there is nothing to lay. Marries, in the north, a woman who bears him a daughter, dies in 1932. The daughter grows up on the story, perhaps not the whole story, perhaps only the version her mother had had from her father, which was Ellen's side and no other. The daughter takes the mother's surname, Hartnell, perhaps for reasons of inheritance, perhaps because the mother had felt that no daughter of hers should carry openly the name of the man who had once been broken by the Halliwells. The daughter grows up. She is intelligent, she is patient, she waits and she plans. She comes in her 40s to St. Mary Mead. She takes a small house. She makes herself over years into a fixture, into a fete committee lady, a jumble sale lady, a lady who is always there. She never mentions the North. She never mentions Durham. She never mentions her father. She joins the church. She sings in the choir. She sits by Miss Halliwell at the fete tea. She sits by Miss Ashe at the choir practice. She learns, in her painstaking way, exactly whom in this village to keep close. And she waits. After all these years, Miss Halliwell had said, on the telephone at 6 o'clock on Tuesday. What had the telephone told her? Miss Marple could not know for certain, but she could guess. She could guess that a voice had said, quite calmly, quite politely, "Dear Cordelia, I have been thinking. It seems to me at last that certain letters ought to come out. certain letters that Ellen wrote, certain names that were kept quiet. I think we ought to speak of them, you and I, perhaps this evening. And Cordelia, whose respectability had been the shield behind which a 50-year-old's silence had lived, had gone white as her linen, and had risen to her writing case, and had sat down to compose, what? Perhaps a confession of her own, perhaps only a plea. It did not matter. She had been sat down at her writing desk, and Miss Hartnell had come to the garden door. Not Miss Ashe. Miss Ashe was the accomplice of the silence, not of the murder. Miss Ashe had been present at the old rectory on Tuesday evening because Miss Hartnell had asked her to come. Miss Hartnell had said, "Emmeline, I must speak with Cordelia. I fear what she may say. Come with me, wait outside, keep watch." And Miss Ashe, who had known, in her bones, since the summer of 1908, that a very great wrong had gone unspoken, Miss Ashe had gone. Miss Ashe had waited in the shadow of the garden shed. She had watched Miss Hartnell go in by the garden door. She had watched the drawing-room grow suddenly still. She had watched Miss Hartnell come out again, without hurry, adjusting her gloves. And on the garden path, Miss Ashe had picked up a peony that had been broken from its stem, because she had needed, poor woman, at that moment, something to hold in her hand. Then Mr. Marston had come round the bend of the garden path. Miss Ashe had, in an instant, made her disastrous decision. She had walked away, behind the shed, before he saw her. She had left the peony where it lay. She had, in her mind, resolved to keep the silence one more day, one more week, forever if needed, because she had, in that moment, believed that Miss Hartnell had been right to do it. That Cordelia had been about to disclose, out of remorse, a scandal that would poison the whole village, and that Miss Hartnell, no matter by what appalling means, had prevented her. Miss Ashe had walked home. She had lain down. She had not slept. On the following morning, this morning, Miss Hartnell had come to Miss Ashe's cottage for tea. Miss Hartnell had said perhaps, "Emmeline, you are troubled. You wish to make amends. Sit down, drink your tea. I have written out something for you in your hand. It is a confession. It is not quite the confession you would write yourself, but it will save many people much pain. It will indeed save you. Sign it, drink your tea, and then, if you can, walk to Ellen's stone. Ellen would like that." And Miss Ashe, because she was a woman who had lived her life believing that pride was virtue and silence duty, had signed, and drunk, and walked, and died. Miss Marple laid down her pen. She sat with her hands folded upon the desk. She had, she knew, no proof. She had a great many small true things, and no one small true thing alone would hang Miss Hartnell, except one. Miss Marple rose, put on her cardigan, and went out. It was 5 o'clock. The village was in its evening quiet. The lilacs at the vicarage were beginning to lose their extravagance. The bees were coming home. She walked without haste down the high street, past the Blue Boar, past the post office, past Mrs. Price Ridley's cat, now sitting in exemplary composure upon its own doorstep, and down the little side lane to Miss Hartnell's house, a red brick, gabled cottage, respectable and with the door on the latch. She did not knock. She pushed the door open. Miss Hartnell was in the parlour. She was seated at her writing desk. She was writing, with her right hand, upon a sheet of good paper. She looked up. She was calm. She had always been calm. Her calmness was the great unbroken instrument of her whole quiet vengeance. "Miss Marple," she said, "do come in. I was writing a letter to my solicitor." Miss Marple came in. She took, without invitation, the wicker chair opposite. She noted, without appearing to note, that upon the corner of Miss Hartnell's writing desk, half hidden under a blotter, was a single, small, brown glass file. "I do apologise," said Miss Marple, "for the intrusion, Miss Hartnell." "Not at all. I wished only to give you back something that I think you dropped, this morning, at Miss Ashe's cottage." She opened her handbag, and from it drew out a plain white envelope. She laid it upon the desk. Miss Hartnell looked at the envelope. Her hand did not move. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "Only," said Miss Marple with great gentleness, "a peony petal, my dear, a fresh one. Miss Ashe had 2 this morning when she came to the churchyard. One was in her hand, the other was in the pocket of her coat. It was, I think, the one she had picked up from the garden path on Tuesday evening and had kept. I have brought it back to its owner." The room was very still. Miss Hartnell's hand, resting upon the desk, remained where it was. Only her mouth moved, the smallest tightening, as of a cord drawn one turn tighter. Its owner, Miss Marple, would be poor Cordelia, not me. Its owner, said Miss Marple, with the same gentleness, is the person who picked it from Miss Halliwell's garden on Tuesday evening and dropped it upon the path when she saw a man come round the corner. Miss Ash saw her drop it. Miss Ash picked it up. Miss Ash carried it. Miss Ash, this morning, brought it with her to the churchyard, because she wished, I think, in the very last hour of her life, to have some little proof about her person of what she had seen. She did not know she would be dying. She died. The petal remained in her pocket. Inspector Slack's young man found it there before we took her home. He gave it to Colonel Bantry. Colonel Bantry gave it to me. I have brought it to you. Miss Hartnell said nothing. Its edge, Miss Marple went on softly, is bruised in a peculiar way, exactly as if a woman's fingernails, a woman with rather long, rather square nails, had pressed into it as she picked it up. Your nails, Miss Hartnell, are long and square. Mine, as you see, are not. Poor Cordelia's were bitten. Miss Ash's were rounded and cut short. The bruise is your bruise. I am afraid the peony has told me so. Miss Hartnell drew a very slow breath. It was the first breath in this business, thought Miss Marple, that had not been drawn steadily. You cannot, said Miss Hartnell, hang me by a petal. No, my dear, said Miss Marple, I cannot. But Inspector Slack, I think, in a few minutes will not require to. He will require only what I have already given him, the account of Miss Ash, which I dictated to him an hour ago, the register from Durham, which he has telegraphed for, and this small brown file upon your desk. It is, I imagine, aconite. It is where you keep it. I noticed, when I came in, that it was not quite covered by the blotter. Miss Halliwell's file you took from the vase on Tuesday, and it will not be found here, for you will have thrown it into the pond at the crossroads on your way home this morning. But this one, I think, was for yourself, if it should come to it. Miss Hartnell looked at Miss Marple. Her eyes at last were no longer blank. They were, for the smallest moment, the eyes of a girl who had been told, in a bare parsonage in the north, that her father had once loved a girl called Ellen, and that Ellen had died of a sudden decline. He never held her, said Miss Hartnell quietly. He never even held her. They did not let him. Miss Marple did not answer. There are certain sentences to which any answer would be a discourtesy. She only inclined her head. At the gate, Colonel Bantry's footstep was heard, and behind it, Inspector Slack's. Section 10. The reveal in the small parlour. Colonel Bantry's footstep and Inspector Slack's came up the little brick path. They did not knock. Miss Marple had left the front door on the latch. They came, quietly for two men in a hurry, into the parlour, and stood a moment inside the door. Miss Hartnell did not turn her head at once. She was still looking at Miss Marple, with the eyes that had, for the first time in 15 years in St. Mary Mead, ceased to be blank. Then, without hurry, she folded the letter she had been writing, laid the pen across the letter, and turned in her chair to face the room. "Inspector," she said. "Colonel Bantry, do sit down. I have been talking with Miss Marple." "So I understand, madam," said Slack. He remained standing. He had, Miss Marple noticed, with a kind of tender approval, taken off his hat. "Miss Hartnell," said Miss Marple softly, "would perhaps prefer that I set out what has happened. She may correct me, if she wishes, where I am wrong. Or she may say nothing. Or she may say what she wishes to say herself. But I think it will be less painful for her if it is put into words by someone who does not blame her, who has, indeed, a great deal of compassion for her, as much as for the two women whose deaths lie between us." Miss Hartnell nodded once. Slack, after a hesitation, sat down. Miss Marple began, as she had begun many stories over many teacups in many parlours, in a voice hardly above the voice of a woman describing a new stitch. 52 years ago, she said, in the summer of 1908, a young cousin came to stay at the old rectory in this village. Her name was Ellen Elwood. Her father was in India. Her mother had died some years before. She was 19. She was pretty, you have all seen the photograph, and full of sudden strong opinions and sudden strong hopes. She fell in love that summer with a young curate whom the vicar of the day had taken in for a season. The curate's name was John Hartnell. He was a good young man, but not a rich one, and not of a family that Mr. Halliwell, Cordelia's father, thought suitable. Mr. Halliwell forbade the match. Ellen defied him. Mr. Halliwell arranged for the curate to be transferred north, Salisbury out, Durham in. It should have ended there. It did not. Ellen wrote to her father in the Punjab, and Ellen prepared, secretly, to run away and marry her John once he was settled. She began, we know this, from a note in her own hand, found in a prayer book, to be afraid. She wrote, "If they do not stop, I shall write to Papa. I shall. Ellen, 3rd September 1908. Within a fortnight, Ellen was dead. The parish register recorded a sudden decline. I do not know, and I do not think anybody now living knows, exactly how she died. It may have been what her mother in Torquay wrote in the letter she left her son, that Ellen did not go willingly. It may have been a fall on the stairs. It may have been an overdose of some sleeping draught given her, quite genuinely, in a mistaken kindness by an aunt who wished to spare her the crying. It may have been that she was locked in her room until she took a chill. It may, we must be fair, have been an honest decline, as the doctor of the day chose to write, and the shame of the family only that Ellen had been unhappy and forbidden and had faded in her unhappiness. What we know for certain is only this, that Cordelia, at 18, was in the house, that Emmeline Ashe, then a young schoolmistress and Ellen's only friend outside the family, was in the village, and that a letter of Ellen's, addressed to her father, was intercepted before it could go into the post and given to Ellen's dearest friend, Mrs. Marston, then a young governess, to keep. Mrs. Marston did keep it, for 52 years. The curate, young John Hartnell, read of Ellen's death in a newspaper. He wrote to the Halliwells once. He was told, "There is nothing to lay." He went on. He married, in the north, a good woman. He had one daughter. He did not tell his daughter the whole story. He told her only that in a village in the south, a girl had once been kept from him and had died of it, and that her name had been Ellen. He died in 1932, when his daughter was 15. Miss Marple paused. She did not look at Miss Hartnell, neither did anyone else in the room. The daughter, Miss Marple continued, grew up. She was clever and quiet and self-contained. When her mother, in the fullness of time, died as well, she found among her mother's papers all that she had not been told. The newspaper cutting, the one letter her father had written and torn up and pieced back together, the name of the village, the name of the family. She also found, I imagine, that the Halliwells had, once a year for 12 years, sent her father small sums of money. He had returned every one of them. But the sums and the pattern and the fact that Mr. Halliwell had continued to send them after Cordelia's father died, and Cordelia herself was mistress of the family, told her a great deal about what the Halliwells thought they had done. She came south. Under her mother's maiden name, Hartnell, she came, 40 years old, to St. Mary Mead. She took the little red brick cottage in the side lane. She joined the fete committee. She sang in the choir, and she waited, and she watched. She befriended, in her painstaking way, both Cordelia Halliwell and Emmeline Ashe. She discovered, in tiny increments across the years, exactly what each of them knew, and exactly what each of them, at last, was willing not to know. She discovered, too, that Cordelia paid a small annuity to a Mrs. Marston in Torquay. She did not know why. She only guessed that a debt was being paid, that Cordelia's ledger entries, £40, to E, as before, were paying, in truth, a debt to Ellen, paying to a woman who had once been Ellen's only outside friend, and who had kept Ellen's letter. It was, I think, Miss Hartnell who, this last spring, wrote anonymously to Mrs. Marston in Torquay to ask whether, in her death, she meant Ellen's letter to become public. It was Mrs. Marston, dying, who gave the letter to her son with instructions to bring it to Cordelia. Miss Hartnell knew he was coming. It was, in fact, Miss Hartnell who telephoned Cordelia at 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening, not to reveal herself, but to speak, in a certain voice, of a certain letter about to arrive by hand at 7, and to suggest that Cordelia had better prepare, before the messenger came, a fair account of what had really happened in September of 1908. Cordelia, hearing this voice, said, "After all these years." She sat down to her writing case. Miss Hartnell then walked to the old rectory. On the way, she asked Miss Ashe to accompany her, saying only that she feared Cordelia was about to speak imprudently in the presence of a stranger, and that Miss Ashe, who had loved Cordelia, must help her to prevent it. Miss Ash agreed. Miss Ash waited in the shadow of the garden shed. Miss Hartnell went in by the garden door, sat down opposite Cordelia at her desk, produced a syringe, and very calmly, very kindly, almost apologetically, administered the injection. Cordelia, who had let her in without alarm, did not resist. She was dead within a minute. Miss Hartnell then took the small phial of aconite that Cordelia had kept, all these years, hidden among the stems of her 3 white roses, hidden there because it had once been Ellen's, and Cordelia had never dared destroy it, had never dared either to be far from it. She took it because she wished to leave the drawing room without trace, and because she wished, if it should come to it, to leave a further trace of her own choosing. As she left in the dusk along the garden path, she picked, half absent-mindedly, a peony from Cordelia's border. She meant, perhaps, to lay it at Ellen's grave. She saw, as she turned into the path, a man coming through the further gate. She dropped the peony. She stepped back into the shadow of the shed. Miss Ash, who had watched her go in and watched her come out, saw all this, but did not for one moment believe that Cordelia was dead. She believed Miss Hartnell had merely spoken with Cordelia. She had heard no cry. She had seen no violence. She had watched only Miss Hartnell go in with a small bag and come out without it. Miss Hartnell and Miss Ash left the old rectory grounds by the field gate at the back. Mr. Marston, at the front, found the drawing room already occupied by a still figure at the desk, and turned away. Miss Ash walked home. Miss Hartnell walked home. Cordelia sat at her desk, at 7 and at 8 and at 9, until Mrs. Dagg came in with the hot milk. In the morning, the news broke. Miss Ash understood then what she had watched. She was, Colonel Bantry, forgive me, she was a woman whose whole moral life had been built on the belief that silence was virtue. She could not bear, in a single night, to unlearn it. She was, moreover, terrified. She was also, this is the hardest part, half persuaded that Miss Hartnell had been right to do what she had done, because Cordelia had been about to disclose, out of remorse, matters that would have shamed both Cordelia's memory and Ellen's memory and the village itself. Miss Ash decided to keep the silence. Miss Hartnell knew Miss Ash could not keep the silence long. She came, this morning, to Miss Ash's cottage. She brought, or made, a pot of tea. She dropped aconite into Miss Ash's cup. She sat opposite. She said kindly, "Emmeline, write it out. Write that you did it. Write that you are going to Ellen's grave to make amends. Do this for Cordelia's memory. Do this for me." And Miss Ash, a woman by then already beginning to feel unwell, wrote. She wrote in her own hand. Miss Hartnell then persuaded her, gently, that she must burn the draft and copy a fair one, so that there might be no crossings. Miss Ash burnt the draft only in part. The fire had not been lit. She had to thrust the paper into cold ash and light a match. A fragment survived. Miss Ash wrote the fair copy and laid it on the table. Miss Ash then walked to the churchyard. Miss Hartnell walked to the pond at the crossroads and threw Cordelia's phial into it. Then Miss Hartnell went home. She took the teapot with her, in the small bag she had brought. She washed it, she dried it, she replaced it upon her own dresser. She did not, however, wash the cup. That was to be the cup of confession. That was to be the cup of remorse. Miss Marple at this point paused and looked at Miss Hartnell. Miss Hartnell was crying quite silently. Her hands still did not tremble. Her tears did not fall onto her cheek. They gathered along her lower lids and were absorbed there and did not fall. She had been trained all her life not to let a thing fall. "The devastating twist," Miss Marple said softly, half to Inspector Slack, half to the room, "is not that Miss Hartnell killed Cordelia Halliwell. It is that Cordelia Halliwell was never Ellen's murderer. Cordelia was Ellen's friend. In September of 1908, it was Cordelia who tried to help Ellen run away. Cordelia who packed the small trunk in secret. Cordelia who arranged the pony cart. It was Cordelia's own father and no other who prevented Ellen from leaving. And it was Cordelia who found Ellen next morning in her room, cold, with an empty draught upon the table. Whether Ellen had taken the draught to sleep and taken too much, or whether Mr. Halliwell, I cannot say. The truth, I believe, will never be entirely known. Cordelia's crime was not that she killed Ellen. Cordelia's crime was that she was told, by her father, that if she ever spoke of what had happened, the young curate would be prosecuted for seducing a girl of 19 and hastening her death. And Cordelia, at 18, believed him. She kept silent, and she carried the guilt of that silence, not of Ellen's death, for 52 years. She sent money to Mrs. Marston. She sent money indirectly to the son. She tended the peonies. She kept the file. On Tuesday she was preparing at last to write the truth. And on Tuesday she was killed by the daughter of the man she had, at 18, tried in vain to save. Killed because that daughter had spent 15 years in a bare parsonage in the north, hating a name that did not deserve, in the end, to be hated. The parlour was very still. Miss Hartnell's tears remained where they were. She said, after a long moment, in a voice hardly her own, "I did not know. I did not know. She never said. She was so serene. I thought that was the face of the murderer." "It was the face," said Miss Marple gently, "of the woman who had been a girl on the morning after Ellen's death, and had stood in the room and had seen the empty cup. It was the face of a girl who did what a father told her, once, and never afterwards. There are many such faces. They are the faces we most easily mistake." Slack rose. He came to Miss Hartnell. He said, without harshness, "Miss Hartnell, will you come with me, please?" She rose. She lifted her handbag. She adjusted on her lapel a small enamel brooch, not, Miss Marple noted, a shepherdess, but a plain silver crescent. It had been, once, her mother's. At the door she paused and turned. She looked at Miss Marple. "I would like," she said quietly, "Ellen's letter to go to Mr. Marston. He is her nearest of kin, in a manner of speaking. And the peony bush at the old rectory, please. Let no one dig it up." "No one shall," said Miss Marple. "I shall see to it." She went. Colonel Bantry followed. Miss Marple stood alone a moment in the little parlour, with the folded, unfinished letter on the desk, and the small brown file half hidden under the blotter. She did not touch either. She only laid her hand, briefly, upon the back of the chair Miss Hartnell had sat in, and then she went out. Section 11. The village at its gentlest hour. Again Miss Marple went out into the side lane. The evening had turned cool. Somewhere in the beeches a wood pigeon was still complaining, though more softly now, and along the hedgerow the first honeysuckle of the season had opened and was pouring its scent into the dusk with the unmeasured generosity of a village that has forgotten to be careful. She walked slowly, not toward her own house, but toward the churchyard. At the gate she paused. The yew was black against a sky of very pale green. The stones of the older graves leaned this way and that, as they always had. Beyond them, at the foot of the great yew, the stone of Ellen Elwood, "She sleeps in peace," was in shadow. The grass where Miss Ash had lain that morning had, already, begun to lift again where it had been pressed. Miss Marple did not go in. She only stood at the gate a moment and thought, an old wrong that had waited a whole lifetime had at last laid down its head. But it had laid it down heavily, and taken 2 women with it as it fell. She thought too of Miss Hartnell, whose last act at Miss Marple's door had been to ask, quietly, that the peony bush not be dug up. There had been, in that request, more of the girl in the northern parsonage than in any word she had spoken since her arrival at St. Mary Mead 15 years before. She turned from the gate and walked home. The next morning, being Friday, the village woke to itself. Mrs. Price Ridley's cat was again upon the post office step, condescending to the sun. Old Mr. Dorridge, who had smiled on Wednesday for the first time in 14 years, was frowning again in his customary way, although Miss Weatherby, meeting him at the pillar box, thought she detected in the frown a certain shy softness, as though something behind the frown had, in the interim, been rearranged. The parish clock, having lost its 3 minutes overnight, gained them back at noon. Griselda in the vicarage garden was making gooseberry fool. The vicar at his desk was writing a sermon on the passage from Ecclesiastes. That which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. He was writing it, upon reflection, without the word new. At 11, Mr. Harold Marston came to Miss Marple's door. He came in his tired coat, but the coat looked less tired than it had done. He had under his arm a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple, I am on my way back to London." "I know, Mr. Marston. Do come in for a moment." He came in. He would not sit. He laid the parcel upon her hall table. "I have brought you," he said, "my mother's letter, Ellen's letter. Miss Hartnell wished, I understand, that it should go to me, and I have it. But I do not wish Miss Marple to keep it. I have read it. I am content. My mother did what she was asked to do. My father, Miss Hartnell's father, was a man who never spoke of the South. I did not know him, of course, but now I understand him a little better. I really do not, wish to keep the letter. If it is not indelicate, I should like you to keep it. Put it in a book of yours. Perhaps let Cordelia's solicitor see it, once, if that is proper, and then let it rest. My mother, I think, would have liked it to rest with you." Miss Marple did not open the parcel. She took it in both hands and inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Marston. It shall rest here. I have a small volume of Christina Rossetti in which many things have rested over the years. Ellen shall lie between the songs." "Miss Marple," he hesitated. "Miss Hartnell, what will happen?" "I do not know, Mr. Marston. There will be a trial. There will be, I imagine, medical evidence. There will, I think, be no death. There will be a place somewhere, quiet and green, where she will spend her remaining years. She is not, in any usual sense, wicked. She is a woman who was given, at 15, a story that had a hole in it, and who spent 40 years mostly in silence, mostly in respectability, filling in that hole with the wrong facts. When she at last laid the wrong facts across the right facts, they did not fit, and by then, too many people were involved." "And Miss Halliwell?" "Miss Halliwell," said Miss Marple, "will lie in the churchyard beside her cousin Ellen, at her own long-standing request. Colonel Bantry has confirmed it. The vicar will say a few words. The peonies will be moved, root and stalk, from the old rectory to a place directly behind the stone. Miss Hartnell asked, at parting, that the bush should not be dug up. I have kept the letter of that request. The spirit permits, I think, its removal to Ellen's side. It is where it belongs." He nodded. He took her hand for a moment, and then he went. That afternoon Dr. Haydock came to see Miss Marple. He came, as was his habit, without ceremony, and he found her in her parlour with the volume of Christina Rossetti open upon her lap, and a fresh letter, Ellen's, laid within it. He sat down opposite her. He said nothing for some time. Then he said, "Jane, you are tired." "I am tired, Dr. Haydock." "You always are, at the end of these things." "I am always tired at the end of these things, because at the end of them I have to be certain all over again that a village is only a village, that it is not, in itself, wicked, that if we are patient it will come back. It does come back. It has come back." "Yes." He watched her a moment. He said, more quietly, "The most terrible thing in the affair, Jane, is not that Miss Hartnell killed Cordelia. It is that Cordelia was, in her own mind, guilty. She had carried a guilt for 52 years that was not hers to carry. That, at the last, is what she was preparing to lay down, on Tuesday evening, at her writing case." Miss Hartnell struck the pen out of her hand. "Yes, Dr. Haydock, that is the most terrible thing. That is why the case has, at its heart, a small, unbearable grief that has nothing at all to do with murder. Cordelia lived her whole life afraid of a scandal that was never hers. Ellen died at 19, with none of what she had loved. John Hartnell died in a bare parsonage with a hate that his daughter inherited. Emmeline Ashe died at the foot of a stone she had visited every September for 52 years, believing it decent to say nothing. And Miss Hartnell, who did the killing, did it because she had spent her life confusing revenge with justice, which is a very old confusion. Every one of them thought silence was a virtue, and silence at the end was what did for all of them. They were quiet a long time. Then Dr. Haydock rose, laid his hand briefly upon her shoulder, and went. That evening, Miss Marple did what she had, in a manner, been intending to do since Wednesday morning at the iron gate. She went out into her own small garden, and she cut, from her own single peony bush at the corner by the sundial, 3 pink blooms. She carried them into the church. The verger, who had known her all her life, did not ask her business. She laid one bloom at the foot of the stone of Ellen Elwood. She laid one at the place where, on the following morning, Cordelia Halliwell would be brought. She laid the third at the foot of the small plain slab under which Emmeline Ash would in a few days be quietly interred. She stood a moment with her hands folded, and she thought, in the manner of a woman whose thoughts have long been kept in the neighbourhood of a childhood catechism, of the words, "Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things." They were, on the whole, a comfort. They were less than a comfort about the fourth, about John Hartnell, who lay in a parish in the north, and about his daughter, who would spend the remainder of her life in a quiet place with green lawns and long silences. There is no letter, thought Miss Marple, that reaches the north from the south, and no letter that reaches the south from the north, that can quite lay down between them what was broken in the summer of 1908. It is the great, sad thing about villages and about human beings. Very small silences make very great gulfs, and no bridge can be flung across them afterwards but the one Cordelia had been about to write and had been prevented from writing. She left the church. She walked home in the last of the light. The lilacs were gone. The honeysuckle was in. Mrs. Price Ridley's cat upon the post office step opened one eye, decided against comment, and closed it again. In the vicarage garden, Griselda called good night. The parish clock from the tower struck the hour truthfully, 3 minutes early. Miss Marple, at her own gate, paused and drew in one breath of the cool air, and then she went inside. Upon her hall table, beside her handbag and her second-best cardigan, lay the little parcel Mr. Marston had left. She took it up. She carried it into the parlour. She laid Ellen's letter, unopened by any hand but its intended, between the pages of Goblin Market and other poems. She placed the book upon the shelf. She sat down. She took up her knitting, and she began, in the gentle rhythm of a woman who has, at 70-odd, learned that the world will come back if only one gives it time, one more row of the vicar's youngest's cardigan, an inch of good, honest wool, laid down between the world and its next disturbance. The end.